Good morning, everyone. I'm really thrilled to welcome you all to this session of the Gender Studies Symposium, Navigating Oppressive Systems. I want to share with you a few details of the event before we hear from our speakers. The first thing is that this session will be recorded and its recording will be posted to a website afterwards. So if that changes your desire to ask questions verbally, please just keep that in mind as we do the session. The second thing that I want to let you know is that we will be holding all of our kind of responses to questions from our speakers until the end of all three presentations. But if you have questions for individual speakers as they're speaking, I invite you to direct them in the chat to Phoenix. Phoenix will be taking all of our questions today and compiling those in the chat. And so if you're listening to one of the speakers and have questions that emerge, feel free to share those via chat to Phoenix. And then after all of our speakers are done, we'll bring up those questions. And also at that point, we will also invite people to raise their virtual hands to ask questions verbally if you would prefer to do so verbally. And so we'll have both questions from the chat and also questions from people raising their hands. My other two announcements are if you have not registered for other events, please do so. Our second keynote speaker is tonight, and there are many other wonderful panels today and tomorrow. So I encourage you all to take a look at the schedule and register for other events. You do not need to pre-register for the keynote speaker, but all other events you do. Finally, unfortunately, one of our speakers on this panel had to withdraw at the last moment. So Samuel Shelton will not be speaking to us today, but we still have three wonderful presentations and I'm really excited to announce all of them. So we will first be hearing today from Katelin Ling Cooper. Katelin Ling Cooper is a senior religious studies major at Lewis and Clark, preparing for law school. And she's a legal doula working with the Portland General Defense Committee, meaning that she provides legal, emotional, and financial support to protesters who are facing felony charges. She also is an editor for the startup Parachute, a multimedia platform created by and for women and non-binary people of color. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Katelin to share your paper with us.
Great, thank you so much, Sarah, and everyone for being here. It is a true pleasure to be here with you all. This paper is called Prisons and Gender Harm. The prison industrial complex, oh, I'm sorry, I'm supposed to time myself. I forgot, gotta do that now. Okay. The prison industrial complex and injustice system at large reinforce strict binaries. Guilty versus innocent, Black versus white, the powerless versus the powerful, and female versus male. These rigid dichotomies are socially constructed due to specific historical constraints and are often expressed through rigid institutions, such as the prison system. By incarcerating folks and separating them according to their gender assigned at birth, the prison system seeks to dehumanize and isolate people in order to ultimately strip them of individual identity. As a result, much of the discourse surrounding prisons and prison activism remains confined within these binaries, and therefore upholds the construction of gender roles and dynamics. We can witness the ways in which expression of gender relates to the prison industrial complex and prison activism by examining how various authors address societal constructions of masculinity and femininity. I put authors Dan Berger, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, and Michelle Alexander in conversation with one another in order to understand how popular discourse surrounding prison activism routinely upholds these binaries and gendered aspects of labor, as can be traced from the evolution of the civil rights movement to our current state of mass incarceration. Black prison organizing during the civil rights era sought to reframe questions of power and representation based on who is encouraged to grab power versus who is excluded from the narrative of power and freedom. Using the revolutionary figure George Jackson as a case study for Black power and subversion of white supremacy in the face of state-sanctioned violence, Dan Berger explores in his book Captive Nation how discourse on gender and sexuality has been intimately linked to the struggle for prison liberation. As a well-read and highly intellectual leader among his fellow prisoners, Jackson advocated for both mental and physical strength as strategies for fighting against state oppression. Jackson sought to maintain his masculinity and the power and authority associated with the masculine image through, quote, his frequent references to physical activity, which revealed a thinly veiled sexual energy. Jackson's writings contained a flirtatious streak, and his sexual appeal became part of his political appeal, end quote. In this way, Jackson embodied a specific image of Black power, which both empowered and inspired other Black men to identify with their expected gender role. Hence, the ideal Black male radical was one who embraced, quote, a hypermasculine vision of prison struggle, end quote. Similarly, as leader of the Black Panther Party, Huey P. Newton was literally and symbolically heralded as an exemplary model for masculine Black power, the physical embodiment of unadulterated freedom. Newton's release from prison was feverishly celebrated by displays of hypermasculinity when, quote, Newton took off his shirt at a rally celebrating his release from prison, revealing the strong physique he had maintained. Photos of the bare-chested Newton appeared in the Black Panther newspaper, on television, and elsewhere. Many radicals saw in his toned muscles a physical embodiment of the coming insurrection, end quote. Such sensationalized depictions of masculinity promote a social expectation for what reclamation of power and liberation should look like, which ends up erasing the presence and contributions of women, femmes, and gender nonconforming people in the prison struggle. With the image of radical political prisoners made hypermasculine, the work on the ground by prison activists was often treated as a differently gendered form of labor. For instance, the Black Panther community programs signaled, quote, a more feminized, if not explicitly feminist current to the party's work. Its community efforts, which Newton dubbed programs for survival pending revolution, emphasized collective nurturing and mutual aid, healthcare, and education, end quote. This holistic portrayal of feminist activism serving the community is vital for sustaining movements both inside and outside of prison walls. This is exemplified in the mobilization of mothers and other caregivers organizing in response to the increasing violence of the carceral state. In 1992, Barbara Meredith and Francie Arbol mobilized in defense of Meredith's son, an ex-gang member who had been arrested on false charges. Thus arose the Mothers Reclaiming Our Children grassroots movement, which became an expansive network throughout Los Angeles and the surrounding area, made up of devoted activists whose children were incarcerated on exaggerated offenses. When mothers in California mobilized to form the Mothers Reclaiming Our Children organization, they quickly realized that their work as grassroots activists and organizers required intense physical, intellectual, and emotional labor, as is the case with so much women's work. Nevertheless, their hard work was both useful and necessary, for these mothers recognized how vital it is to care for an undercared community. In the book Golden Gulag, Ruth Wilson Gilmore explains how historically, quote, motherhood functioned through and as an attribute of the woman as laborer, enacted as collective or social rather than individualized practice, end quote. The Mothers ROC movement was predominantly comprised of Black and Brown mothers and caregivers who recognized in their mother work and maternal practices a potentiality for transformative healing, working within a framework that values maternal responsibilities and familial obligations, not as an isolated private form of labor, but rather as necessary community work. In this sense, members of the Mothers ROC originally began mobilizing for their individual child, but soon it became apparent that their struggle was a collective one, and that, quote, collective mothering is the practice from which political action springs, end quote. This expression of militant motherhood and solidarity among caregivers is vital for understanding how embracing constructed gender roles and engendering the mythology of motherhood becomes sustenance for radical movements. On the other hand, it is an unfortunate reality that women, especially mothers, but also parents, partners, children, and friends, did much of the work to support prisoners. Yet they remain largely unknown, rarely discussed, unless it is in relation to a male prisoner. Media misrepresentations of individuals who get caught up in the overlapping webs of the prison system overwhelmingly contribute to societal constructions of binary gender roles. Popular culture diminishes the political contributions of Black femme activists, instead fabricating and fetishizing a narrative in which their inherent value is based upon their utility as a love interest. In Captive Nation, Berger extensively writes about Marxist scholar and radical activist Angela Davis. However, it is only in relation to her association with George Jackson, describing her rather passively as, quote, George's comrade and love interest, end quote. Popular culture further hypersexualized Davis through songs and cinema, for, quote, the cultural symbol of Black women in relation to the prison system was often understood through heterosexual romance, end quote, so as to discredit the work of women and femme people by devaluing their contributions to radical prison organizing. This media dehumanization of Davis was necessary in order to champion her as a, quote, trope of Black womanhood, end quote, signaling the ways in which American society narrowly constructs femininity. This mode of hypersexualization paradoxically denies Black femininity, lest it be perceived as weakness, while also perpetuating a mythology of othering Black women within activist spaces. This can best be represented through the juxtaposition of constructed narratives in the media of Angela Davis and Assata Shakur, arguably two of the most well-known Black women prison organizers of the 1970s. On one hand, quote, Davis received widespread praise as the princess of the Black Revolution, end quote. Whereas on the other hand, the media villainized Assata as the mother hen of the movement. In her autobiography, Shakur writes about how, quote, Robert Daley, who at one time was the public relations and publicity director for the New York City Police Department, had written the book Target Blue. An excerpt from the book was coincidentally printed in the New York Magazine on almost the exact day our trial was to begin. One or two chapters were about the Black Liberation Army. The book was a collection of sensationalism, groundless accusations, and outright lies. Daley implied that I had been responsible for the deaths of numerous policemen. He called me the soul of the Black Liberation Army, the mother hen that, quote, kept them fighting and kept them moving, end quote. Both of these serve as examples of the sexist degradation of the female gender in media portrayals, in which their individual actions and political agency are discounted due to their personal relationships, whether romantic or otherwise. These misrepresentations in media reflect the oppressive power of patriarchal expectations engendered within carceral structures, in that women who attempt to subvert their social role are treated as outcasts, whereas women who accept and lean into their prescribed social role are viewed honorably. In this way, heteronormativity operates through the media we consume, reproducing a culture of misogynoir. This term was coined by queer Black feminist Moya Bailey in 2010 as a combination of misogyny plus noir, referring to the anti-Black sexism that Black women face as a double-edged sword, in that it extrapolates and violates the Black femme as a mythical object to both fear and revere sexually. Throughout the civil rights movement era, many radicals envisioned a reversal of the American social order, and specifically directed their indictments of American society onto the American family structure. Desiring a world where Black Americans are not only free to survive, but to truly thrive, dominant discourses stressed that patriarchal family structures were crucial for this vision to come to fruition. Agonizing over the instability of the family, many individuals, regardless of gender, attributed the subordination of incarcerated Black men in society to the pitfalls of Black matriarchy. Within the prison walls, every aspect of the carceral state seeks to dehumanize, isolate, and control the individual's thoughts, actions, and relationships. Such an environment simultaneously discourages and perpetuates hypermasculinity, insofar as its main purpose is to house hardened criminals until they become docile, submissive citizens. Thus, it is a rather common theme that male radicals, whether alt-right or leftist, have a tendency to obsess over maintaining patriarchy and heteronormative nuclear family models in order to reclaim their power and authority. Moreover, another way the prison system shapes gender ideology is through the disruption and displacement of family and community members. Lamentations over the loss of patriarchal family structures continue to permeate the American consciousness, as Michelle Alexander points out in her book, The New Jim Crow, when she references former President Obama's speech on fatherhood and moral responsibility, which contributes to an ongoing public discourse regarding, quote, missing Black fathers, end quote. The myth of missing fathers can be debunked due to the reality that, quote, hundreds of thousands of Black men are unable to be good fathers for their children, not because of a lack of commitment or desire, but because they are warehoused in prisons, locked in cages. They did not walk out on their families voluntarily. They were taken away in handcuffs, end quote. This is critical for understanding the ways in which the prison system not only fabricates this myth of missing fathers, but also violently disrupts families and displaces caregivers from their homes, thus perpetuating a harmful social norm. It is a tragedy and a travesty that, quote, 80% of young African American men now have criminal records and are thus subject to legalized discrimination for the rest of their lives. These young men are part of a growing undercaste, permanently locked up and locked out of mainstream society, end quote. The false narrative that the prison industrial complex has concocted contributes to the rigid binaries that dictate much of American culture. These constructed social roles within the gender binary end up harming everyone, regardless of gender identity, because they prescribe one's life path as soon as they are born, especially for Black and Indigenous people and those from low-income communities. As we have seen, sometimes embracing our expected gender norms can be a useful strategy for radical organizing, but this does not work for everyone. Given that prisons reinforce oppressive gender and sexual norms, as well as reinforce dominant relations of power, it is important to consider how queer theory can offer valuable models for dismantling the prison industrial complex. Prisons and carceral systems are harmful, violent, and incredibly damaging spaces, especially for queer, trans, and gender nonconforming folks and people of color. The book Captive Genders, Trans Embodiment and the Prison Industrial Complex, edited by Eric Stanley and Nat Smith, is a collection of stories, essays, and interviews that center the experiences of Black, Indigenous, and people of color who are trans and gender nonconforming, whose lives have been deeply structured by the prison system. This is a great starting place to learn more about how we might recalibrate our conceptions of gender in order to subvert state-sanctioned violence while cultivating communities that are life-affirming. To cultivate communities of care and ultimately abolish the conditions that produce prisons, we must prioritize and center the leadership of non-white, trans, and genderqueer activists in order that we may collaboratively build a society where all life is valued as truly sacred. Moreover, in order to dismantle the prison industrial complex, we must engage in feminist analyses and employ queer praxis to subvert these false binaries that we collectively internalize. The philosophy of abolition articulates a different vision in which the constraints of the gender binary and other false binaries such as guilt versus innocence have no place in a society that considers justice and healing as intimately related. Overall, alternatives to policing in prisons better prevents violence, strengthens queer and trans communities, as well as fosters social, economic, and racial justice through rehabilitation and restoration. Thank you so much for listening to me.
Great. I will give an individual round of applause to signify our collective applause here. Thank you so much for that wonderful talk. As I mentioned earlier, and for those of you who came in late, if you have questions for Katelin that you want to put in the chat, please direct them to Phoenix, and Phoenix will collect those questions in the chat and be able to share them at the end of all the presentations. I now would like to introduce our next speaker, Sam Harrell. Sam is a second-year doctoral student in social work and social research. They participate and work with critical resistance, and they're also teaching critical history of children, youth, and families. So without further ado, I will pass things over to Sam.
Hi, it's great to be here. Let me just get my screen share up and running. Okay, great. So this talk is called Care and Coercion, a history of social workers as prison wardens. My plan is to talk about a little bit about what carceral social work is and why it matters today, and then how we got to that point. And then specifically hone in on something I'm really interested in, which is social workers' role as prison wardens in the progressive era. And then just leave us with some questions about the implications of that work and that legacy. So to start, I just want to consider like what carceral social work is. So when I say carceral, I'm thinking about anything really related to prisons, policing, and surveillance. So, you know, carceral social work is everywhere. Social workers are asked to police and surveil and punish people. I've been asked to in every job I've had. We're expected to collaborate and collude with police. We're expected to act like police. And in the past year, in response to a lot of the abolitionist calls in the uprisings, some people have asked social workers to work for police departments and become police social workers or even become cops themselves. So, I could talk a lot more about that, but my main interest today is talking about how we got here and how the past can inform some of the decisions and choices we're making right now around social work and the carceral state. So first, I just want to talk about some of the carceral roots because not a lot of people really know a lot about this, including social workers. So at the beginning of the professionalization in the US of both social work and policing and prison work, these fields were really intricately connected. So the original like professional social work conference was called the National Conference of Charities and Corrections. So at the very beginning, we see the mission and the work of these fields of correction work and social work being aligned. The picture on the left here, that's Frederick Wines. He co-founded that social work conference and is considered by some people to be the first professional social worker in the US. He was also the secretary of the National Prison Association. On the right is a photo of Zebulon Brockway. He co-founded the National Prison Association, was a prison warden and a frequent speaker at those early social work conferences. So, you know, these sort of larger carceral institutions really helped promote early professions in corrections and social workers, especially women who were just trying at the progressive era to, particularly white women, to get out of the home and to develop early careers into specific types of carceral work. So the first, many of the country's first police women were social workers. This first photo of Alice Stubben Wells, she was the first full-time permanently appointed policewoman in the US in 1910. She argued that it was critical for her ability to do good social work to be able to have arrest powers and police powers. The next photo is of Alzina Stevens. She was the first probation officer in Chicago, and social workers were many of the first probation officers in the country, and they helped develop the juvenile probation system in particular. And on the right is a photo of Miriam Van Waters. She's one of many of the early wardens of prisons, particularly for women and children in the progressive era. She did national surveys of early prisons. She also was the led for 1 year the Fraser Detention Home in Portland, Oregon, for the folks here that are in Portland. I want to clarify when using the word prisons and wardens that a lot like today, these facilities weren't called prisons. In fact, they were called so many different things that it's really hard to study them. For women and children in particular, we hear words when we read histories, we hear words like industrial schools, colonies, reformatories, training schools, detention centers, houses of refuge, and homes. And all of those words refer to facilities largely where people were sentenced to by courts, held against their will, detained there for indefinite periods for many people. So not given exact sentences. A lot of minors had to stay in these facilities until they turned 18 or 21, and a lot of adult women were sentenced indefinitely until the warden or the social worker warden decided that they were safe to release. Folks in these facilities were forced to do labor. They were leased out to primarily white people's homes for forced domestic work. They were surveilled constantly, and a range of torture practices were used, from whippings to semi-starvation to drugging to induce nausea. So when we're reading histories about progressive era, institutions, it's easy to see words like training school or industrial school and just glance past that, like it's not a prison. But one of my key objectives here is to argue that was a prison, and that this was prison work that social workers were doing, and then to ask what that means for us today. So I'm gonna talk about 3 of these women and what they did and sort of what their legacy is. So this first one is Martha Falconer. She was recognized as one of the best authorities on the care of delinquent girls and women. She was a settlement house worker in Chicago, which is considered the more progressive arm of early social work. And she was also a probation officer. So in 1906, she founded a house of refuge in Philadelphia, and then moved all of the women and girls in that prison to a new place called Slayton Farm. And there she became a really big proponent for rural prisons, because she liked that they took women and girls and put them really far away from society so that people couldn't really see what they were doing and girls couldn't run away easily. And she also liked that it facilitated farm labor. She made people that were imprisoned there split their time between farm work and domestic training. She argued that academic skills weren't important because the people there that were imprisoned there were, quote, mentally disturbed, or, quote, low grade, which really creates some tension with them being called schools, these facilities. And like many wardens, she insisted that girls, regardless of why they were there, stay until they were 18, and that women have indefinite sentences. This is one of many quotes from her, where she talks about girls and women needing women-specific prisons because their problems were different. And this is really tied to her work as a eugenicist. She, like a lot of social workers in that era, used the term feeble-minded as a catch-all term to describe women and girls that she felt needed to be controlled. So this combines ableism with racism, work against sex workers, immigrant women, sexually active women, queer folks, because we have to remember that just like today, when we say prisons for women and girls, we're also including, the boys and the queers and the agenders and everyone in between who are trapped in those facilities. And she advocated for long-term commitments for sex workers, specifically so that they couldn't have children, which was a common eugenicist strategy of reformers in that era. So what made her work progressive? Because when we read about her in history, she's called a progressive reformer. Some things that made her prison work seem progressive is that instead of traditional prison dormitories, she championed this cottage system where girls would be separated into small buildings by gender and by race. So it would be easier to surveil them and also to prevent communication between the cottages. So, this is remembered as a way of doing prison work that looked like homes, that looked really familial, but it actually had some really overt motivations around surveillance. She talked about how she didn't use corporal punishment. Instead, she did things that were considered creative, like color coding girls' uniforms to represent their behavior or their goodness. And she staffed her prison with social workers, which is a common strategy of that era. Next, I want to talk about Janie Porter Barrett. She founded the first official Black settlement house in the US, and one of her explicit goals in that work was getting Black children out of adult jails. Because at this time, you have a lot of women social workers saying, we don't believe that girls and children, period, and women should be in these jails where men are held. And there's lots of reasons for that, and we'll talk about them. But largely, they were talking about white women and white children. So they were developing what they considered to be gentler, kinder prisons for white women and children, leaving Black girls and Black women still in those facilities. So Janie Porter Barrett was one of many Black women in the US and in the South in particular that said we need to get these Black girls out of adult jails. So she was a part of developing a parallel system of imprisonment, trying to get Black girls access to the same kind of gender and age responsive prisons. So in 1915, she spearheaded a campaign to fund and open the Virginia Industrial School for colored girls. And like Martha, she insisted that those girls be given indeterminate sentences, so she would decide when they would be ready to leave, and she leased them out for forced labor in people's homes. I think this quote here, where she talks about taking a poor human wreckage that is such a dead loss and waste and turning it into an asset for the state, is demonstrative of one of her many goals, which was to uplift. She talked about it as racial uplift and helping protect Black womanhood that she saw as at risk, particularly in the South at the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century. So what made her work progressive? Like Martha, she used the cottage model. So again, tried to make this prison work look like homes and families. She's remembered as doing Black History Week programming every year, again, to promote what she called racial uplift. And she brought in social work students to do research on prisoners there. And she also had some creative ways of surveilling people, including a big sister program where older prisoners would be assigned to newer prisoners to report on what they did all the time. She also did creative types of punishment. Her color coding system was very specific. So patchwork on your clothes meant untidiness. Brown meant untrustworthiness. Blue meant that you were making progress, and white meant that you were a successful prisoner, which is obviously a very racialized coding system. And the last person I want to remember, and I think it's really complicated and interesting, Carrie Weaver Smith. So she had a medical background, but was also a social work leader at that time nationally. And she was the warden of the Texas State Training School for Girls. And unlike Martha and Janie, her prison only took minors and also held them till they were 21. She was also an outspoken eugenicist. She attributed delinquency to interracial couples and to disabled people having children, and would do surveys of the prisoners' parents and then use those statistics to fight for laws that prevented interracial marriage and civil commitment for disabled folks. She said in 1922, someday I'm going to be the most dangerous woman in Texas, armed as I am with facts on delinquency. She was a really weird person. She was considered an expert on juvenile delinquency, and she was responsible for a massive expansion of the correctional system, which I'll talk to. And at the same time, she was an outspoken critic against it. So she argued that communities were better positioned to resolve problems than courts. She advocated that prison wardens organize under educational associations, not prison associations. She fought with the legislature in Texas all the time. She wanted to abolish the juvenile court in its entirety and replace it with truant officers and scientific workers, a really good example of a carceral reform. She refused state money to build a fence around her prison. She was investigated by the state for paroling girls into private homes and transferring them to other prisons without consent. So she got into a lot of trouble and had a lot of fights with the state. She eventually moved to Chicago to work with Jane Addams, who is pictured here on the right. And there she worked with people to design a women's court, a women's prison, a bureau for police women, and a farm colony for women prisoners. So what made her work seem progressive? She didn't have any farm work. Which was easier to do because her prison was only for white people, so they had more funding from the state. She felt it was more important to focus on feminine domestic training, so people didn't do a lot of physical labor in her prison. She established the first Girl Scouts in a prison and the first Young Women's Christian Association. A few years later, the Girl Scouts would make a big announcement that they weren't going to have any more chapters in prisons, but she was seen as really progressive for doing that. So, you know, how did this work come to be seen as progressive? Again, because whenever we're reading about this in social welfare history, we just read that social workers were early prison reformers and child savers. And we learned that these were necessary reforms, right? Because prisons were for everyone. We had kids, women, men, everyone in these facilities at the same time. There were lots of many motivations for this work. So people felt that they were saving women and girls from dangerous and male-dominated institutions. Some people felt that they were saving boys and men from being sexually tempted in co-ed prisons. Some felt that they were saving society from a future generation of people born to women and girls who were considered delinquent and consequently disabled. So that's eugenicist thinking. Some people felt that they were saving the sanctity of Victorian womanhood or Black womanhood. And all of these women felt that they were doing God's work. So these women, they accepted carceral logics. They didn't ask if prisons were appropriate responses to social problems. Instead, they asked, how do we adapt or reform prisons to more effectively cage specific populations? So Martha, she was the first warden to make prisons really resemble schools and homes with that cottage system. Janie was the first one to build specialized prisons for Black girls, offering the same right to a gentler and kinder prison as white girls. And Carrie fought to expand progressive incarceration to imprison older women, disabled people in prisons and asylums. So I just want to end with why I think this matters. Social work's history and correctional leadership, it's not common knowledge, not among students, practitioners, or researchers. Again, we make vague references to child welfare or juvenile justice reform. I think that we can benefit from a more honest and thorough history of carceral legacies, including the work and influence of these early prison wardens. The goal of this archival work that I'm doing is not to demonize these people and not to polarize their work as exclusively carceral. You know, their legacies and what they did are really complex. And if willing, I think that we have a lot to learn from their choices. We remember them as progressive, as social workers and child savers. And while their efforts were understood as progressive at the time, I argue that they built a foundation for the expansion of the carceral apparatus that we have today. And I think it's important to consider how the current work of social workers colluding and collaborating with cops in the state might be remembered a century from now. And how what came of the reformist interventions we made in the early 21st century to invest more power and more resources in policing, surveillance, and imprisonment got us to where we are today and can inform our future decisions. Thank y'all.
Thank you so much, Sam. Again, a big round of applause that I will give you here and that I know others are giving you virtually as well. That was a really fascinating history with, as you mentioned at the end, really important implications for our current carceral system. Our next and final speaker is JahAsia Jacobs. I'm so thrilled to introduce JahAsia, who is a recent Lewis and Clark graduate, sociology, anthropology major with a minor in ethnic studies. JahAsia works currently with the African American Alliance for Home Ownership and Downstreet Housing and Community Development as an intern and a racial equity assistant. She really excitingly is going to start a graduate program in anthropology at Princeton in the fall, and she's motivated by Black feminist theories about feeling, work, and collective organization. So without further ado, I will pass things over to JahAsia.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. Okay, make sure I can present. So hello, everyone. My name is JahAsia Jacobs, and I'm really excited to share a segment of my senior thesis titled Collections in Crisis, Black Affective Publics and the Suspension of Student Loan Payments During the COVID-19 Pandemic. I want to start by saying thank you to the Gender Studies co-chairs, to Kim Brodkin and Magdalena Roberts, and everyone else on the planning committee who organized this incredible event. In thinking about the theme of lack and absence, it's hard to not consider our pandemic landscape, where many of us are aware of what's missing from everyday life. And though the focus on what's left out can seem limiting, I think this practice and thought is quite productive, especially as we consider what goes unacknowledged or what is intentionally suppressed from prominent conversations around gender, race, and power. Throughout my own thesis, I grapple with the reality that Black borrowers and Black women in particular carry the heaviest student debt burdens in the United States. And while scholars across disciplines have conducted research trying to contextualize this issue, the question of how it actually feels to be Black and in debt is absent from this literature. So writing in this continued moment of loan suspension, I used interviews, ethnography, content analysis, and participant observation to determine how Black borrowers feel about their student debt and how they navigate the digital interactions with their loan companies. I argue that loan company websites often pressure Black borrowers for repayment through racialized visual and verbal material that produces negative feelings, or what I call affects, such as anxiety, stress, and hatred. And furthermore, loan company web pages reflect a political ideal of personal management, broadly defined by theorist Wendy Brown as a pressure for citizens to adapt to diminishing and privatized social services like higher education by paying out of pocket for these services, altogether ignoring the reality that so few people can actually cover the exorbitant costs for tuition, for healthcare, childcare, and so on. Though my informants are entangled in this affective grip, they respond to this individualized pressure by using collective feelings like love and care to form solidarities that are in favor of debt cancellation, gender liberation, and Black livelihood. The chapter that I want to elevate today is titled, "I'm Just Doing This to Pay My Loans, Flexible Feminized Labor." It focuses on how anxiety, hate, and urgency crop up for my informants as they navigate their student debt and work in domestic labor positions to make payments. Some of my informants are recent college grads approaching the unique intersection between the end of their 6-month grace period and the middle of the federal suspension on loan payments due to COVID-19. And many of my informants return home unemployed, confronted by a hostile pandemic job market. Sociologist Jason Houle admits in his text, Into the Red and Back into the Nest, that even before the pandemic, young postgrads routinely came back home unemployed or in entry-level job positions. And he calls this pattern a boomerang effect, suggesting that the likelihood of boomeranging is especially strong for Black borrowers, as debt is more burdensome, due in part to discrimination and hardship in credit, college, and labor markets. So all of my interlocutors are living at home with their parents right now. And the pandemic has ushered in some of the highest employment rates that we've seen since the Great Depression era. So a whole study reminds us of the ways in which racism and fickle employment hinders Black graduates' opportunities to start a career after college. Scholars are also growing more interested in how the anticipation of a heavy student debt burden directs people into academic fields and subsequent employment positions that they might otherwise avoid. This consideration for how student debt is reshaping divisions of labor appeared in my own interviews. So Kayla, a recent graduate from a college in North Carolina, shared a poignant reflection with me. As she said, "Now I'm babysitting 2 little white kids in West Orange, and I've always considered myself to be poor, and now I'm really like, damn, people who are poor don't got shit." Kayla wants to be a physician. Her plan is to pay off her Nelnet student loans and then apply to medical school. So in this reflection, she's admitting to feeling especially poor while she's babysitting for 2 white children. That moment when she says, damn, people who are poor are lacking so much is really important. The use of the word damn and the subsequent hesitation that followed in our own interview represents a verbal expression of weight, of recasting poverty as sacrifice and postponing a career to settle a debt. This isn't the reality that Kayla predicted for herself, and it's certainly not the reality that colleges or loan companies will elevate on their web pages. Although here you can see Nelnet warns their customers that your federal student loans can't be canceled or forgiven because you didn't get the education or the job that you expected. This statement is a tacit acceptance on behalf of this loan company that higher education does not always, or perhaps even often, yield mobility. And Kayla isn't the only Black female graduate of my informants who's entangled in domestic labor with white children. Leah majored in exercise science at a New York college with the aim of finding a career to apply her skills. And now she's a self-identified nanny working with suburban white kids in Boston, Massachusetts, and living at home. Just a few minutes into our interview, she repeated the same phrase about 5 times. She says, "I have to pay back these loans some way, somehow. I'm just doing this to pay off these loans. I had a boss who graduated in 1989 and is still paying off her student loans. And that's ridiculous. I loathe my loans, especially because I didn't have a job for a while. And I was constantly like, how am I supposed to afford to pay these loans back?" So Leah's vocal repetition and her affective engagement here are really revealing. Her hatred is evocative. One might envision this linguistic repetition of have to pay back these loans as one of the elementary detention prompts that teachers sometimes give students, where they're tasked with writing a phrase repeatedly until they internalize the lesson. Anthropologist David Graeber opens his work, Debt, the First 5,000 Years, claiming that the moral charge, one must always repay one's debt, has been an anchoring philosophy for social and financial systems for thousands of years. Graeber puts Leah's sense of creeping hypnotic anxiety into context as a manifestation of this historically rooted ideal of individual responsibility, that under all circumstances, one must repay one's debts. These feelings derailed her career plan and conditioned her to be more flexible with her job prospects. And this didactic focus on repayment appears on Nelnet's website. The icon for setting up the quickest repayment plan features a bunny racing to an unseen finish line. And pay as fast as you can is written below. Words like pay or fast and you all cohere with the visual association of racing. These perceived interactions tug on moral and cultural ascriptions to racing, which usually allow the participant only 2 options, winning or losing. And Leah never told me what might happen if she didn't pay off her loans. She just spoke about the finish line, about repayment some way or somehow. Some of my other informants were unique. Marcus, who's a psychology major, works with young Black children in the nonprofit sector, fundraising for schools and enjoying his self-proclaimed ideal job. And Sadie quickly secured a job with Goldman Sachs in New York right after graduating. So neither of them really needed to be flexible in choosing their employment. But my point is that more largely, Black, low-income female borrowers are often finding themselves in positions of low-paying reproductive labor, by which I mean raising children, home maintenance, receptionist work, and so on, in order to service their student debts. Scholar Curtis Mares builds on Cedric Robinson's theory of racial capitalism to argue that financialized higher ed is a mechanism that's pulling racialized and gendered people in to intentionally support racialized reproductive labor. He continues, debt effectively serves to track women of color into the service sector, where if they do get jobs, servicing their debt works to keep them in that sector. So while Sadie offers an exception to the pattern of racialized and gendered work from my informants, a larger snapshot reveals the misogynoir contours that are nested between higher education and divisions of labor. Sociologist Elizabeth Higginbotham provides additional context on this point. Drawing on long-term qualitative research she did that follows 56 Black female graduates entering the US college system in the mid-20th century, and this was at the time of emerging financial assistance like Pell Grants and loans. She eventually admits that while many of her informants entered these professional and managerial positions in the 70s, middle-class Black women were able to leverage their family's financial resources and secure career work more easily than working-class Black women. Higginbotham expands class categories with her term social class, helping her capture the levels at which Black women were able to utilize extra monetary resources to build a career. She writes, quote, "Distinctions in occupational and work roles attest to the lasting aspects of social class as a cultural experience. And as a group, working class Black women's parents were negotiating in a labor market with fewer resources than that of the middle class," end quote. So with this, I recognize that there's an overall economic and professional growth for Black women, but Black women of lower social class backgrounds are largely not a part of that upward trend. Acknowledging these class divisions reminds us not to collapse Black women's experiences with work, student debt, or capitalism as monolithic. It's also imperative to understand that my informants didn't seamlessly or intentionally accept their occupational positions. Their sentiments around the reality of student loan repayment, like anxiety, hatred, or feeling poor, oriented them to this work. My informants were desperate to take on any job they could find to start chipping away at their debts. And this felt sense of urgency is arguably informed by the insistence on personal management. Specifically, the pressure for individuals to manage themselves as they would manage a business or their professional portfolio, and to stay flexible with regard to employment. Anthropologist Ilana Gershon's text, "Selling Yourself in the United States," explores how the neoliberal self must adapt to job insecurity, episodic and contractual employment, and the scarcity of work benefits. The contemporary employee is open to the whim and the contingency of the job market. One owns oneself as though one is a business, a collection of skills that must be continually maintained and enhanced. So while Gershon goes on to analyze virtual employee profiles, the crux of her article puts this felt sense of immediacy for my informants within the systemic pressure to adapt to economic uncertainty. Kayla and Leah had to cultivate new skills and sharpen old ones to start the domestic labor positions that they entered because they didn't prepare for this work in college. It's not what they paid for. Anxiety, repulsion, and urgency become racialized through this idea of personal management. The expectation of flexibility and career choice obscures and euphemizes the historic exploitation of Black women's work. In other words, Black women have predominantly done care work in the United States across centuries, and the erasure of this grossly undercompensated labor through the vernacular flexibility and adaptability produces anxiety, repulsion, and urgency for my informants. The expectation that Black borrowers and low-income women particularly must adapt to unexpected shifts of the job market ignores the reality that many of them will continue to do this type of low-waged work without ever achieving a career that reflects their undergrad experience. Black female borrowers are often pushed into long-term, highly exploitative positions under the guise of romanticized adaptability when we are overqualified and over-indebted for these positions. As I mentioned at the start of this presentation, although my informants are couched in these emotionally taxing interactions with their loan companies and their occupational roles, my informants respond to these experiences, and they respond with feelings like love and care. And not love in a giddy sense of good feeling, but following Black feminist scholar and tonight's keynote, Jennifer Nash, love is a political project, a serious undertaking aimed at collective liberation. My informants participate in anti-capitalist and pro-Black collectives. They join the NAACP and they'll try to promote policies to mitigate student debt. They share informal knowledge about Pell Grant and healthcare between each other, frame debt cancellation as a form of reparations, and engage in so many other efforts out of a recognition of obligation. So these feelings not only shed light on what alternative economic formations are available to us, but they also redeem and depart from the assumption that to be indebted is to always be burdened. Caring for others, forging sister solidarities around love, sharing resources, it all implies a productive association with debt. So navigating the student loan system not only entails anxiety, hatred, or urgency from my Black low income and female informants, but it also entails the embrace of collective responsibility and support that operates against anti-Blackness, against misogynoir, and against capitalism more largely. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, JahAsia. Another big round of applause and a huge round of applause for all three of our presenters. They were all really fascinating, fantastic talks, I think, that touched on a lot of different aspects of what we can think of as oppressive systems in the US. So as I had mentioned earlier, you are welcome to direct questions via the chat to Phoenix. I will also open things up to people who want to raise a virtual hand, and you can ask questions that way as well. Phoenix, do we have any questions in the chat?
Yeah, we actually have a few. So the first question is directed to Katelin, and it's, how does the binary of gender play into the binary of guilt versus innocence?
That's a really great question. I think really it's this facilitation of binary thinking as a this or that rather than a both and really just the idea that it's a not a self-designated identity to say like, oh, I you know, sometimes we'll think of ourselves as like bad people, and that's a really hurtful, harmful narrative that was imposed on us maybe when we were young, rather than showing us that we are individuals first and we make choices that maybe, you know, have different consequences that dictate how we are perceived in the world, but we are always able to like step out of that box that has been built around us. And so in that way, I think of the binaries of male and female, male versus female, and guilt versus innocence as these fixed boxes that are socially prescribed, and that we're told we can't subvert or even like critically think about why these boxes are placed on us. And so in that way, I think there's that relationship between gender and social perception of like what a good or bad person looks like, and it ultimately you know, boils down to who is able to have agency to step outside of the box, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thanks so much for that answer. We can take more of the chat questions. As I said, you're also welcome to raise a virtual hand if you have other questions that you want to ask. Maybe just I'll ask a quick follow-up, which I was really struck by the connection between Katelin, your talk, and Sam's talk. And it seemed like in some ways, Sam, what you were saying is that the role of social workers in reforming prisons in a way that they created a gender divide, maybe is part of the history of what has led to these really deeply entrenched gender binary divides within the carceral system today. So I don't know, Sam, is that part of what you were saying in your talk too, is that aspect of reform is also part of what has entrenched these deep gender binaries within the incarceration system?
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, some scholars, well, one scholar in particular has written some interesting stuff on also just the weirdness of that phenomenon, considering that a lot of early social workers in many ways weren't prescribing to standard gender roles. They tended to be single women, a lot were lesbians. They had careers, and at the same time, they were tasked with explicitly policing people's sexuality and gender. And then all of that looked different when policing women of color. And I think, I mean, one way we see that today is we still have states and social workers working to open and expand gender responsive prisons. So like Indiana, where I'm from, which has the first women's, well, the first, some people call it the first women's prison in the country. They have, they are somewhat famous for their program that allows some women with children to have their babies grow up in the prison. And this is seen as super progressive. And again, it's that that hard issue of reform when if our only option to what the state considers crimes is prison, then yeah, it seems great to have a mom stay with her kid in a prison. But that's within like this purview where we're not considering literally any other response or redefining like what crime and what harm is. And I think, you know, a lot of people that work with people are talking to women in particular, because we know that, you know, such a huge proportion of women in prisons are moms. It's hard to say no to that. We see that right now with electronic monitoring and e-carceration. If you're working with a ton of moms in prison who are saying, yes, I would much rather have an ankle bracelet and be with my kids, it's easy to see that as the long-term answer, you know. But I do think we can imagine that differently, looking back at exactly what you said, how our relationship to gender and progressive incarceration, changed over time.
Thanks so much. And thanks for the cat entrance too. That was a perfect Zoom moment, I feel like. Great. Phoenix, what other questions do we have in the chat?
Yeah, we have a question for JahAsia, and it's, did you feel like you needed to go to grad school to postpone your debt?
I love this question. Yes, absolutely. I mean, that's not the only reason why I wanted to extend my educational experience, but I mean, it's real. And I've had a lot of conversations with people about like this so-called native anthropologist of like doing this work and writing. And so that's kind of an abstraction, but also recognizing that I am in the same position, you know, and was doing this work in the same position as so many other Black women I talked to. I definitely think it was a part of my decision, just a material recognition that I don't have the resources to pay. And I'm in like $30,000 of student loan debt. Like I have a lot, I believe in being really transparent about this kind of stuff. Like I have a lot of debt. And so the thought of having to work out how I'm gonna pay that off at 22 and the uncertainty of this moment of suspension, which luckily has been extended beyond December when I did this project, but it's still very much unclear what's going to happen. I definitely saw it as a productive route for me to try and keep doing my studies and, you know, eventually, hopefully, if I can, instruct other people. But yeah, there's a period now of like 5 to 7 years where I won't have to be thinking about that. So I definitely want to make it clear that it was a part of, it factored into my decision. Absolutely.
We don't have any virtual hands, so we'll just keep taking questions from the chat.
Yeah, this one is for Sam. It says, how do you reconcile your own position in the social work system in terms of its relationship to the prison industrial complex? And in what ways does queerness influence your approach to social work?
Yeah, to the first question, I take cue from other countries in separating professional social work and just the act of like social welfare and social working. The US is somewhat unique in that we have just have a lot of title protection and have tried to take entire traditions of helping people and make it a profession. In some ways where you can be criminalized for doing things if you aren't licensed and such. So what gives me hope around being in social work alongside its carceral legacy and current work is separating out social welfare work and professionalized social work. I think that people that get training in social work have a ton of awesome skills. You know, like I think it's not, some people get this naturally and they get it from their communities and they get it from just practice. And some people go to school to learn crisis intervention and de-escalation and communication and how to respond to needs at different levels. And I think it's okay to get those skills in different ways, and it's how we use them that matters. And we just use that information in really troubling ways all the time. You know, a big thing is just gathering information for the state with mandatory reporting, with really complex data information systems that share information across probation, police, welfare systems. So I don't think a lot of the skills are bad and the knowledges are bad. I just think it's what our ultimate goal and purpose is. And then queerness and social work. I'm going to say the same thing. I've worked as I've like supported queer youth programs in the Midwest as a social worker. And I think, again, a lot of my social work like training and background made that possible. And I remember having so many heartbreaking conversations with queer youth where they would ask me like, are social workers safe people? And I would just have to say, absolutely not. Like it really doesn't clue you into that. They're not necessarily pro-trans, pro-queer at all. I had people in my master's program who went on to be therapists, who openly talked about in class that they did not believe gay marriage should be legal because they believed it would lead to an increase in pedophilia. And this wasn't challenged, it wasn't questioned as like a problematic thing to say, and they're therapists today. And it's just, social work doesn't guarantee anything, I think, around values, even though it purports to be a value-laden profession. But again, I think that gaining skills in mutual aid work, de-escalation, crisis intervention, et cetera, absolutely has a role in like strengthening queer communities. It's just how we use it.
Thanks for that. Do we have more questions still, Phoenix?
Those are all of the questions I have to this.
Okay.
point.
Other questions from the audience? Again, you're welcome to raise. There's a pretty big group, so I obviously can't see people, but you're welcome to raise a hand. Yeah, Cameron.
This is for like anybody, but what kind of like drew you into being passionate about the certain subjects you presented today? Like, was it you kind of learned about it? Was it personal experience, mix of kind of all? Like, I'm just curious as to how you kind of got to where you guys are.
Great, maybe let's start with Katelin on that.
Thanks for asking that question, Cameron. Well, this paper was originally written for a class as just like a regular assignment. So the three authors that I like put in conversation were assigned readings, and I was really drawn to seeing the way that the carceral system structures gender ideology and reproduces gender ideology through the words and deeds of the individuals themselves who were and have been involved in prison movements. And it's also something that I'm like still witnessing being, reproduced in some of the activist circles that I'm involved in, where like we have a commitment to a set of values of centering women and non-binary voices and like centering horizontal collaborative work, and yet it still manages to reproduce, pretty patriarchal, tendencies in just how we relate to each other, and it just really reveals how deeply ingrained it is. And so as I was considering this theme of lack and absence, I was just really interested in, what are the ways in which voices are invisibilized or misrepresented, especially through the media that we consume, which itself is a really big mode through which the prison industrial complex is legitimized over and over. And yes, and I'm also really interested in how people on one hand feel left out because or not only feel left out, are deliberately left out because they don't fit into a gender binary, and how that also we can hold multiple truths at the same time, how that is not necessarily in contrast with people who do really identify with their given socially prescribed gender roles, such as the mothers of the Mothers Reclaiming Our Children movement, And so that's something that I'm actually exploring in my thesis this semester about militant motherhood movements. So yeah, gender's all around us. Always good stuff.
Great, thanks. Sam, did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I think what motivated me is I grew up in a family that did a lot of criminalized activities, including things like drug dealing and drug use and sex work, and also a lot of physical violence. And so while we were constantly, doing criminal things, my family being white, I grew up with a fear of like police and social workers, but not a hatred, and I think a part of that was because they looked like us. Especially my family wasn't quite working class, but wanted to be, and a lot of cops and correctional officers they're working class white people, largely in rural spaces, policing largely Black and brown folks in cities. So, it was interesting because my family, a lot of members of my family were constantly thrown in jail, and child welfare was, always like around the corner, but those people weren't enemies. And just as a white person and social worker, I think it's just inherently connected, is like how I feel really invested, and in particular in thinking about white, poor, and rural folks, interrogating their investment in the carceral state. And I think for a lot of social workers, it's jobs and it's power, and it's like benefiting from the power of policing and prisons. So I'm just interested in understanding that better and trying to help folks strategize to undo it. Yeah.
Thanks for sharing that. JahAsia?
Yeah, so I guess mostly my interest in topics around student debt and feeling came from my own personal experience, which I think is a lot of the paths that people go through to get interested in research. And then, let's see, my junior year, I took at the same time a course on affect theory with Kim Cameron Dominguez in the SOAN department, and an elective course on debt and its discontents with sociologist Marianne Bylander. And I at first didn't expect those two classes to intersect in any way. And we, halfway through the semester, read an article in my class about debt that was by a sociologist named Joe Devil. And it was about the ways in which collections, call centers in the UK use emotional manipulation in order to secure repayment from people. And I was really interested in that, since I was having conversations about embodiment and feeling and emotion in the class, in the affect theory course. So from that point on, so junior year, I did some work like with quantitative research and tried to do some surveys and public opinion data gathering in the class, and sort of arrived to this point where I was like, I think methods like ethnography and interview, other types of qualitative methods, were getting me closer to the kind of writing that I wanted to do around this. So yeah, that was about 2 years ago, somewhere around there. And more specifically now, since doing all of this research, I am really fascinated by the ways in which student debt sort of, from the moment that students enter college, will direct their career paths. So people, I think more mainstream, and a more mainstream sense, people still assume that college is a mechanism where you go in and you say, I want to be pre-med, and you come out and you're going to be on that track. But and from my own personal experience too, like I went in thinking that exact thing, and switched my own major. And I think a lot of students are switching their majors out of recognition that they don't want to be in so much debt. So that, hints at a ton of new and really interesting and important questions around how breakdowns and in the divisions of labor, and figuring out what types of work people are doing around this sort of anticipation and fear and anxiety that they'll have to take on all the student debt if they pick the major that they initially wanted to go into.
Great, thanks for that. I have a follow-up question for you too, JahAsia, and then Phoenix also said we have one more chat question, which is the intersection of race and all this too. So I'm just thinking about recent Lewis and Clark grads that I know, and I have a recent Lewis and Clark grad hired right now to be a babysitter for my family, right, in COVID times. And so it feels like I can think of lots of grads who have gone into this kind of work, whether it's sort of care work and some level, or work that they don't think of as necessarily leading to a career path. And I just wonder if you have a sense, I know you were talking about this particularly for Black women in your informants, but I wondered if you see this like on a much bigger scale that transcends racial lines, or if there's something more specific about how it's impacting Black women, recent graduates, that's different than how it might be impacting, say, women who identify as white women, but are also, taking on some of these caregiving or other kinds of roles that they may not think are leading in a professional direction.
Yeah. So this is a part of, I still have to do more research. So a part of the scope of the thesis is that it's 3 months. So I really am interested in this question as well. But I don't know that there's a mechanism that is really putting Black women in particular back into these like domestic roles that we've done since, the experience of slavery and beyond that. And if there's a mechanism that simultaneously does that and then puts non-Black or white women into different care positions. But I do know that the embodied experience for Black women in these positions like immediately brings up historical memories and a recognition that Black women have sort of always been doing this particular kind of labor. So I'm fascinated. Like I genuinely would love to do more work and understand if there is something about contemporary capitalism and this system of financialized higher ed that's producing different kinds of work for women of different racialized backgrounds. But in my own work, I guess I've just seen that it's more of like the recognition that the work that Black women are doing is like historically rooted and there's a pattern of it. And so that racial awareness comes in that moment. And I'm sure that it does come before that, but I want to do more research about sort of the systemic stakes in that experience.
Yeah, thanks. That's really helpful. I think that taking that kind of historical perspective, right, of the role of Black women in US society too makes a lot of sense in trying to unpack some of that. Okay, Phoenix, I'll turn back to you for another chat question.
Yeah, this question is for Sam. Can you share a bit about the ways you envision the work or role of social workers in criminal justice reform?
Yeah, well, I'm an abolitionist, so I think, I envision them as not reforming a system that was never meant to protect people. So the criminal punishment system is meant to protect property and to protect whiteness and capital. I imagine social workers using like awesome skills and knowledge from experience and from training to meet needs that are real, like health, education, housing, relationship building and repair. Like we have all that in lots of communities, particularly communities of color and some queer communities have been taking care of those needs forever. And the state, including social workers, just try to fuck with that, try to come in and take charge of identifying and naming the problems and then trying to like respond to them. So I think among all the social workers in the country and also people that aren't called social workers but do welfare work and mutual aid work, I think we have the resources and the skills to just meet needs and define problems for ourselves and redefine harm and redefine safety. So that's really broad, but definitely feel free. If anyone is like really interested in social work and alternatives, I definitely have lots of very specific examples and resources. So I'll put my email in the chat.
Great, thanks so much for doing that. Do any of the presenters have questions for each other or other things that this conversation has made you think of that you want to share with us? Yeah, JahAsia.
So this is like fully open-ended, and I'm just thinking about Sam's comments about like mutual aid work. And in my own research, I also promote a lot of mutual aid work, and I'm trying to reconcile the recognition that like the state already isn't really providing anything for people. So like we already have such diminishing like healthcare services, childcare, and so I'm wondering if sometimes I worry that the prominent, like the growth of mutual aid doesn't really combat that logic right now, that like we can have we can pull these resources together on our own, and the state sometimes I feel like would be like, that's great. Like we don't really want to be we're not giving you anything already. So I'm not really asking for a solution. So I'm not really proposing a definitive question. I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts around that tension between the recognition that we have so few social services and what we do, they're entirely privatized and incredibly expensive, and reconciling that with like maybe falling into that logic by saying, well, we don't need to require anything or demand anything from the state.
Yeah, I have two quick things. One is like a strategy, and one is just politics. So some abolitionists would describe themselves as like socialists or communists, and some are anarchists. So part of what I said is because I'm anarchist. So I just want to acknowledge that.
Great.
that
yeah, that makes a lot of sense, definitely.
Yeah, so some people do see a definite role for the state. I should have said that. Not me, but some people. So I think there's different visions of definitely. But the second thing I think is helpful is that one strategy that critical resistance offers is dismantle, change, build. And what I like about it is those are simultaneous strategies, and they're not ordered. So they say that, you know, to accomplish an abolitionist future, we need to dismantle, so decrease the power and scope of carceral systems. We need to build what we need, and we need to change how we relate to each other. And all of those happen at the same time. And I think that's sort of key partially to like what you're bringing up, and that not all of us are going to do all of those things personally. Like we're going to invest our energies in different parts. So I think some people, you know, see an abolitionist future with a more robust state welfare system, and some don't. And yes, tension. It's like such a complicated diagram.
Yeah,
I love that question.
I also am just glad that you brought up the idea that like doing mutual aid work, right? If it's a long-term project and there's a broader set of goals, might look different from, let's say, like a charity effort or something, because you do have these shared goals that you're making clear to the people that you're organizing with, and sort of, yeah. So thank you for that. Got a lot to think about.
Thank you. Same.
Yeah, I don't have like a lot of clear, concise thoughts, but I really appreciate what you shared, Sam. And yeah, I agree. People have different right motivations for engaging in mutual aid. They can overlap, and I think if anything, like, yeah, witnessing that tension it's tough, but it's helpful for at least seeing how unsustainable our current mode of government and like political economic system is. And you know, I mean, this whole past year and a half has been so tragic, but it's definitely really revealed to more people than ever before how racial capitalism really does not care about working class people. And I guess if anything, it's like witnessing the upsurge in mutual aid and calls for community engagement is just like a reminder that we're not just like individuals separate. We need interdependence, and we need to rely on each other and our community members, and And like, we're not really taught how to be vulnerable. And it can be very terrifying to say, hey, like, I really need help, especially with money, because we have a lot of shame culture around that. But yeah, it's something that I definitely am also struggling with. Like, how do we turn it into a sustainable practice? Because yeah, we're all getting burnt out by it.
Thanks everyone for your wonderful presentations, audience for your participation via questions, and hopefully this was an inspiration to those of you who are students to see the work that current and former students are doing, and also the work that you can do beyond Lewis and Clark, both in an activist realm and in a more academic realm, that there's, as we all know, lots of work to be done in thinking through a lot of these really complicated questions, as we saw questions around oppressive systems, but how they interact with things like the moral valence of labor, right? I was kept thinking through all of your presentations of how there's this moral sense of related to work and the kind of work that we do and what work looks like, right? Whether it's the cottage farms, right? And how that's is seen as progressive because it's people are working in a moral way, or the kinds of work we do post-graduation, right? And these intersections, as we saw really clearly in the presentations, across gender and race and class. And so thank you all for those wonderful presentations and for bringing all these pieces together and giving us so much to think about. So a big round of applause to our three presenters. Thank you so much to the symposium co-chairs, to Kim Brodkin for all your work. Thank you all for being here. And as I said earlier, I highly recommend that you check out some of the other events happening and hope to see you at some of the other events as well. Take care, everyone.